You can't do this!
Stop resisting! Order! I demand order!
Justice!
Stop them!
Get off me!
Stand down now! Bailiffs, control this!
You planted it!
Liar, you framed me!
Corruption!
Order! Order in the court!
It
Never! Get off!
Fight! No cover up!
Ah, get back! Ah.
You planted the evidence!
Liar! You're going down! Order! Order in the court!
Not until you confess!
Never!
You'll pay for this!
Fight! Fight! No justice!
The sharp crack echoed through the oak-paneled courtroom like a gunshot. A grown man, a veteran police officer, with a badge pinned to his chest, had just drawn back his hand and slapped a black military police officer across the face in front of a judge, a jury, and dozens of witnesses. For a fraction of a second, the room descended into a suffocating, breathless silence. Officer Brock Whitaker smirked with smug satisfaction, convinced he had finally put her in her place. But Staff Sergeant Maya Ellison didn't cry. She didn't shrink. Instead, her eyes went cold. Her military combat training locked in, and seconds later, Whitaker was staring blindly at the ceiling, knocked out cold on the courtroom floor. This is the story of the slap that ended a corrupt career and the brutal, undeniable karma that followed. The air inside the Oak Ridge Municipal Courthouse was stale, smelling faintly of lemon floor wax, old paper, and nervous sweat. It was a dreary, overcast day that seeped into your bones. Staff Sergeant Maya Ellison sat at the heavy mahogany defense table, her posture impeccably straight. She wore her Army service uniform, the dark blue fabric pressed to a razor's edge, the brass buttons catching the dull fluorescent light above. The medals on her chest were not for show. They told a story of multiple deployments, commendations for valor, and years of specialized combat and law enforcement training. Yet here she was, sitting in a civilian courtroom, facing a misdemeanor charge of resisting arrest and disorderly conduct. Next to her sat attorney Marcus Hale, a weary but razor-sharp defense attorney who had spent years dismantling the lies of corrupt local cops. Marcus leaned over, adjusting his wire-rimmed glasses. "He's going to lie, Maya," Marcus whispered, his eyes scanning the courtroom. "Whitaker is the precinct golden boy. He's going to get up there and paint you as the aggressor. You just have to stay entirely calm. Do not let him bait you." Maya didn't turn her head. Her dark eyes remained fixed on the empty witness stand. "I deal with belligerent, intoxicated soldiers twice his size for a living, Marcus. A local bully with a badge isn't going to break my bearing." The bully in question was Officer Brock Whitaker. He pushed through the double doors at the back of the courtroom a moment later, walking with a swagger that bordered on comical. Whitaker was a large man, barrel-chested and red-faced, wearing a tailored police uniform that looked a size too tight across the shoulders. For years, Whitaker had treated the town of Oak Ridge, which bordered the massive Fort Campbell military installation, as his own personal fiefdom. He had a notorious reputation among the locals and the service members. He was a cop who despised the military. He hated the way soldiers carried themselves. He hated that they didn't immediately cower when he flashed his lights. And most of all, he hated being challenged. The incident that had brought them to this room had occurred late one night in pouring rain. Maya was driving back to base after a long shift, her civilian vehicle moving precisely at the speed limit. Whitaker had tailed her for some distance before lighting her up. His justification was a swerving motion, a complete fabrication. When Whitaker approached her window, he immediately demanded she step out of the vehicle and submit to a search. Maya, knowing her rights and recognizing an illegal fishing expedition, had calmly refused. She provided her license, registration, and her military ID, firmly stating she did not consent to a search of her property without probable cause. Whitaker had lost his mind. Accustomed to terrified teenagers and intimidated locals, the sight of a calm, collected black woman, cleanly reciting her Fourth Amendment rights, had shattered his fragile ego. He had yanked her from the car, slamming her against the wet metal of her door, barking orders. Maya hadn't fought back. She had gone limp, complying physically while verbally demanding a supervisor. Whitaker, desperate to justify his excessive force, had slapped the cuffs on her, and booked her for resisting. Now, the trial was meant to rubber stamp his authority. "All rise!" the bailiff bellowed as Judge Harlan Voss entered the room. Voss was a no-nonsense magistrate, a man with thinning white hair and a deep scowl etched permanently into his features. He slammed his gavel down, taking his seat and peering over his reading glasses at the prosecution and defense. "Docket number 409B, State versus Ellison," Judge Voss announced, his voice a low rumble. "Let's get through this. Prosecution, call your first witness." Prosecutor Lena Hargrove, a young attorney who looked like she'd rather be anywhere else, stood up. She knew this case was a toxic liability. She had seen the dash cam footage, which mysteriously glitched right before Whitaker got physical, but she was pressured by the police union to push the charges forward. The state calls Officer Brock Whitaker to the stand. Whitaker swaggered down the aisle. He didn't just walk, he occupied space. As he passed the defense table, he allowed his eyes to drag over Maya, a sneer twisting his lips. He took the oath, his hand resting lazily on the Bible, and sat in the witness chair, spreading his legs wide and leaning back. For the next stretch of time, Whitaker spun a masterful, practiced lie. Guided by Hargrove's hesitant questions, he painted a picture of a dark, stormy night where he felt his life was in danger. He described Maya as erratic, aggressive, and non-compliant. "She was shouting profanities, Your Honor," Whitaker said, looking earnestly at the judge. "She refused lawful orders, reached toward her center console, and when I attempted to secure her for my own safety, she aggressively shoved me backward." Maya sat perfectly still. Inside, a cold fury was taking root, but her face was carved from stone. She had survived ambushes in combat zones. She wasn't going to crack because a mediocre man in a cheap uniform was telling fairy tales. "Thank you, officer," Hargrove said quickly, sitting down. Judge Voss looked over to the defense. "Mr. Hale, your witness." Marcus Hale stood up slowly, buttoning his suit jacket. He walked to the podium, letting the silence stretch for a long, uncomfortable moment. When he finally spoke, his voice was deathly quiet. "Officer Whitaker, you testified that my client reached for her center console, making you fear for your life. Is that correct?" "Yes, sir," Whitaker replied, his chin jutting out. "Fascinating," Marcus said, picking up a document. "Because the impound inventory report, filled out by your own precinct, the night of the arrest notes that the center console of my client's Honda Accord was jammed completely shut due to a broken latch. It took a crowbar from the impound lot mechanic to open it the next morning. How exactly did she reach into a sealed box, officer?" A murmur rippled through the gallery. Whitaker's face flushed, a mottled red creeping up his thick neck. The silence in the courtroom was suddenly heavy, pregnant with a tension that made the air feel thick. Whitaker shifted his massive weight in the witness chair, the wood groaning in protest. His eyes darted toward the prosecutor's table, but Hargrove was intensely studying her legal pad, entirely abandoning him to the wolves. She was attempting to pry it open," Whitaker stammered, his confident swagger evaporating. "The intent was there. She was making furtive movements." Marcus Hale smiled, a predatory gleam in his eyes. "Furtive movements, a convenient phrase. Let's talk about your dash cam, Officer Whitaker. You testified that the system experienced a corrupted file error exactly before the alleged physical altercation. Is that correct?" "That's what the tech guys told me," Whitaker said, his voice rising in defensive volume. "I don't control the equipment. It malfunctions." "It does malfunction," Marcus agreed smoothly. "However, I subpoenaed the maintenance logs for your cruiser. The system was serviced and given a clean bill of health the very morning of the arrest. Furthermore, an independent forensic audit of the hard drive, which the judge granted me last week, shows the file wasn't corrupted. It was manually paused from the console inside the vehicle." "Objection!" Hargrove shouted, jumping to her feet. "Defense is testifying." "Overruled," Judge Voss snapped, leaning forward, his eyes narrowed at Whitaker. I am very interested in hearing the officer's answer. Answer the question, Officer Whitaker. Did you turn off your camera? Whitaker gripped the armrests of the chair, his knuckles turning white. He looked at Maya, who was staring back at him with an unblinking, utterly calm expression. Her serenity was driving him insane. He was used to people sweating, crying, or begging. Her silent, dignified defiance felt like a physical attack on his manhood. No, Whitaker spat. I was fighting a resisting suspect in the pouring rain. Maybe my elbow hit the button. I don't know, but she fought me. No further questions for this witness, Your Honor, Marcus said, turning his back on Whitaker with an air of complete dismissal. Judge Voss looked disgusted. You may step down, officer, and frankly, I am deeply troubled by the inconsistencies in this testimony. We will take a short recess before I hear closing arguments, though I believe my mind is already made up. The implication was clear. Voss was going to dismiss the charges. Whitaker had lost. The judge struck his gavel and disappeared into his chambers. The gallery erupted into a low buzz of whispers. Maya stood up, smoothing the front of her uniform jacket. She felt a profound sense of relief, but she kept her face neutral. She turned to Marcus. Thank you. That was surgical. He dug his own grave, Marcus said, packing his files into his briefcase. I'm going to grab a coffee from the hall. Don't go anywhere. As Marcus walked away, the courtroom began to clear out. Only a few spectators, a couple of bailiffs near the doors, and the court reporter remained. Maya stood by the defense table, picking up her military cap and preparing to wait out the recess. She didn't see Whitaker approaching until his shadow fell over her. He hadn't left the room. Instead, he had climbed down from the witness stand and marched straight toward the defense table. His face was no longer just flushed. It was a dark, dangerous shade of crimson. A vein throbbed visibly at his temple. His breathing was heavy, ragged with unchecked rage. You think you're pretty smart, don't you? Whitaker hissed, stopping mere inches from her face. He was a foot taller than her, attempting to use his sheer physical bulk to intimidate her. Maya took a half step back to maintain a tactical distance, her posture rigid. Officer Whitaker, the proceedings are paused. I have nothing to say to you. Please, step away from my table. You arrogant little... Whitaker spat, lowering his voice so the bailiffs across the room couldn't hear, though his aggressive posture had already drawn their attention. You think because you wear that shiny little costume, you can come into my town and embarrass me? I own these streets. You're nothing but a... He muttered a racial slur, so vile, so venomous, that it hung in the air between them like poison. Maya's jaw tightened, her eyes locked onto his, cold and absolute. You're a disgrace to that badge, she said evenly, her voice steady and quiet. And after today, you'll be lucky if you're writing parking tickets at a mall. Something inside Whitaker snapped. It was the complete lack of fear in her eyes. It was the absolute certainty in her voice. The realization that he had not broken her and that he was about to face humiliation from the judge pushed him over the edge of rational thought. In a fit of blind, uncontrollable rage, Whitaker raised his right hand, pulling it back past his shoulder. Hey! Shouted one of the bailiffs, stepping forward from the double doors. But he was too late. With all his weight behind it, Whitaker swung his hand in a wide, vicious arc. The sound of the open-handed slap was deafening. It cracked like a bullwhip, echoing off the high oak ceilings and the marble floors. The force of the blow snapped Maya's head violently to the side, knocking her military cap from her hands and sending it skittering across the floor. A collective gasp sucked the air out of the room. The court reporter dropped her transcription machine with a clatter. Prosecutor Hargrove, who had been lingering near the front, froze in absolute horror. A police officer had just assaulted a uniformed member of the armed forces in open court. For exactly a moment, Whitaker stood there, his chest heaving, a sickening smirk beginning to form on his lips. He thought he had won. He thought he had finally established his dominance. He was catastrophically wrong. When you spend years in the military police, where the difference between life and death is measured in fractions of a second. Your body learns to react before your conscious mind can process the threat. It's called muscle memory. You don't think, you act. When the strike landed, Maya's head snapped left. A stinging heat bloomed across her cheek, but she didn't stumble. She didn't fall, and she certainly didn't cry out. Instead, her training took over with terrifying efficiency. As her head whipped back to center, her eyes were no longer those of a calm defendant. They were the eyes of a soldier engaging a hostile target. Whitaker's arm was still extended across his body from the follow-through of the slap, leaving his entire left side and jaw exposed. His feet were parallel, his center of gravity high and unbalanced. A rookie mistake. Before Whitaker's smirk could fully materialize, Maya shifted her weight. She pivoted on her back foot, driving her hips forward to generate maximum kinetic energy. Her right hand formed a tight, bone-crushing fist. She didn't throw a wild, emotional haymaker. She threw a textbook, devastatingly precise right cross. The punch traveled a short distance, but it carried the concentrated force of her entire body weight, fueled by suppressed injustice and the sheer instinct of self-defense. Crack! The sound of Maya's knuckles connecting with Whitaker's jaw was entirely different from the slap. It was a sickening, hollow thud, the sound of bone violently meeting bone. Whitaker's eyes rolled back in his head before he even began to fall. The sheer concussive force of the blow snapped his head sideways, short-circuiting his nervous system instantly. His knees buckled outward like a marionette with its strings cut. His massive frame plummeted toward the floor. He hit the heavy oak defense table on the way down, his shoulder splintering the edge of the wood before crashing onto the marble floor. He didn't brace himself. He didn't put his hands out. He simply hit the ground like a sack of wet cement and lay completely motionless, his arms splayed awkwardly. A thin trickle of saliva pooled at the corner of his slack mouth. He was out cold. Total, paralyzing chaos erupted. "Holy hell!" screamed Prosecutor Hargrove, scrambling backward and tripping over her own chair. "Officer down! Officer down!" yelled Bailiff Jackson Drake, frantically unholstering his radio as he and his partner sprinted across the courtroom. The door to the judge's chambers slammed open, and Judge Voss burst out, his black robe billowing behind him. "What in God's name is happening out here?" he bellowed, looking from the unconscious giant on the floor to Maya. Maya stood exactly where she had been. She had already stepped back, creating a safety perimeter. Her hands were raised in the air, open and visible. Her posture neutral. She was breathing slightly heavier, but her face was a mask of absolute chilling calm. The red handprint on her cheek was already beginning to swell, a stark contrast to her dark skin. "He struck me, Your Honor," Maya said, her voice projecting clearly over the shouting bailiffs. "He approached my table, used a racial slur, and delivered an unprovoked physical strike to my face. I neutralized the immediate threat in self-defense. I am unarmed and compliant." Bailiff Drake reached Whitaker, dropping to his knees. He grabbed his radio. "Dispatch, we need EMS at courtroom 3 immediately. We have an officer unconscious." Drake looked up at Maya, his hand resting nervously on the butt of his sidearm. He had known Whitaker for years, but he had also seen the whole thing. Attorney Marcus Hale burst back into the courtroom, holding 2 cups of coffee. He stopped dead in his tracks, dropping both cups. Hot coffee splashed across the marble floor. He looked at Whitaker, then at Maya, then up to the judge. "Bailiff, secure the defendant," Judge Voss shouted, pointing a shaking finger at Maya. "No!" Prosecutor Hargrove suddenly yelled. Her voice was shrill, cutting through the noise. Everyone froze and looked at her. Hargrove was pale, pointing a trembling finger at the ceiling. "No, Judge. Do not arrest her. I saw it. The bailiff saw it. Whitaker attacked her. He walked right up to her and hit her." Judge Voss looked at Bailiff Drake. Drake slowly took his hand off his weapon and nodded. "It's true, Judge. Whitaker initiated contact, swung on her hard. She hit him back once. Drake looked down at the unconscious man. Just once. Get medical in here now, Voss commanded, rubbing his temples. He looked at Maya, his eyes softening slightly, noting the angry red welt on her face. Sergeant Ellison, lower your hands. You are not under arrest. A low groan escaped Whitaker. His eyelids fluttered, and he slowly reached a hand up to his face, wincing in agony. His jaw was visibly out of alignment, already swelling. He blinked, the harsh lights blinding him, completely disoriented. What? What happened? Whitaker mumbled, his words slurred. What happened? Brock, Marcus Hale said coldly, stepping over the spilled coffee. That was you just committing a felony assault on a military officer in front of a judge, a prosecutor, and 2 bailiffs, and you just lost a fight to a woman half your size. As paramedics rushed through the doors with a gurney, Whitaker's blurry eyes finally focused on Maya. She was looking down at him, adjusting the cuffs of her uniform jacket. She wasn't gloating. She wasn't smiling. She just looked at him with a cold pity reserved for a cornered animal. But the real karma hadn't even begun to hit yet, because as Whitaker was being strapped to the backboard, his jaw fractured in 2 places. Attorney Marcus Hale was already looking at the courtroom's ceiling-mounted security cameras, the cameras that had captured every single second in high definition. The flashing red and white lights of the ambulance painted the pale walls of the courthouse hallway as paramedics wheeled Officer Brock Whitaker away. His jaw, now rapidly swelling to grotesque proportions, was stabilized in a rigid cervical collar. He moaned through teeth that no longer aligned, his eyes wide with a potent mixture of concussed confusion and dawning terror. Inside the courtroom, the chaotic energy began to settle into a stunned, heavy silence. Judge Harlan Voss stood at the bench, rubbing his temples, looking at the puddle of spilled coffee and the splintered edge of the defense table. Sergeant Ellison, Voss said, his voice stripped of its usual booming authority. Are you requiring medical attention? Maya stood beside her attorney, her posture as rigid as it had been earlier. The red handprint on her left cheek had darkened into an angry bruised welt, but her breathing was entirely controlled. Negative, Your Honor. I am fully operational. Marcus Hale looked at his client, his eyes wide behind his wire-rimmed glasses. He had spent his entire career fighting the uphill battle against badge-heavy local cops, but he had never witnessed an immediate physical delivery of justice quite like this. Maya, that was muscle memory, Maya said quietly, reaching down to retrieve her fallen military cap. She dusted off the brim with a sharp, precise motion. Prosecutor Lena Hargrove was still sitting on the floor by her table, her hands trembling. She looked up at Maya, her expression a mix of awe and sheer panic. I can't believe he did that right in front of us. He just threw away his entire life. He threw it away a long time ago, Ms. Hargrove, Maya replied, her tone devoid of sympathy. Today was simply the day the bill came due. Before Judge Voss could officially dismiss the proceedings, the heavy double doors at the back of the courtroom swung open. A man in a sharp charcoal gray civilian suit strode in. He moved with the undeniable clipped authority of high-ranking military brass, though he wore no uniform. He flashed a heavy gold badge at the bewildered bailiffs. Captain Marcus Kane, United States Army Criminal Investigation Division, the man announced, his voice echoing in the cavernous room. He bypassed the prosecution and walked directly to Maya, offering a crisp, subtle nod, which she returned. Marcus frowned, looking between the federal investigator and his client. CID. What does Army CID have to do with a local misdemeanor traffic case? Captain Kane turned to the judge. Your Honor, I request that the courtroom be sealed and the security footage from the last stretch of time be immediately impounded into federal custody. The assault that just took place is now Exhibit A in an ongoing federal probe. Judge Voss leaned back in his leather chair, his eyebrows practically disappearing into his hairline. A federal probe? Captain, perhaps you should enlighten the court. Maya finally let a small, tight smile touched the corners of her mouth. This was the moment, the hidden hand she had been holding for months. Officer Brock Whitaker wasn't just a local bully who hated the military, Your Honor, Maya explained, her voice steady and echoing with newfound authority. For some time, CID has received dozens of anonymous reports from junior enlisted soldiers stationed at Fort Campbell. They reported being systematically targeted, illegally searched, and extorted by a specific clique of officers within the Oak Ridge Police Department. Whitaker was the ringleader. Marcus's jaw dropped. You weren't just driving home that night. No, Marcus, I wasn't, Maya confirmed, turning to her lawyer. I am not just a base MP. I am an undercover operative attached to a joint CID and FBI anti-corruption task force. I was driving that specific route at that specific time, driving a vehicle registered to a low-ranking alias, specifically to bait Brock Whitaker into an illegal stop. The courtroom was dead silent. The twist hung in the air, heavy and absolute. Whitaker hadn't just slapped a defiant soldier. He had assaulted a covert federal investigator who had spent months building a RICO case against him. We needed him on the record committing perjury to establish a pattern of falsified police reports, Captain Kane added, handing a thick manila folder to Judge Voss. Sergeant Ellison maintained her cover flawlessly, even enduring a false arrest to ensure Whitaker felt comfortable enough to lie under oath today. We anticipated him lying. We did not, however, anticipate him committing a felony assault on a federal officer in open court. Hargrove let out a breathless gasp from the prosecution table. He's done. He's completely done. Worse than done, Counselor, Kane said coldly. We already have warrants being executed at the Oak Ridge precinct as we speak. By the time Whitaker wakes up from his concussion protocol, the world as he knows it will no longer exist. Judge Voss looked down at the bruising on Maya's face, a profound respect settling in his eyes. Sergeant Ellison, your discipline is extraordinary. The charges against you are dismissed with extreme prejudice, and Captain Kane, you will have the unedited security footage within the hour. As Maya walked out of the courtroom, the heavy wooden doors closing behind her, the first domino in Brock Whitaker's catastrophic downfall had just been tipped. Brock Whitaker drifted back to consciousness on a sea of agonizing, throbbing pain. The sterile, biting smell of rubbing alcohol assaulted his nostrils, and a relentless, rhythmic beeping drilled into his aching skull. He tried to open his mouth to groan, but a sharp, blinding agony shot through his face. His jaw wouldn't move. It felt locked in a cage of wire and fire. He blinked his eyes open. The harsh fluorescent lights of the Oak Ridge Memorial Hospital blinded him. As his vision swam into focus, he realized his head was heavily bandaged, and his jaw had been wired completely shut to stabilize a severe fracture. He wasn't alone in the room. Sitting in the vinyl visitor's chair next to his bed was Gage Langford, the president of the local police union. Gage was a pragmatic, ruthless man who had spent years shielding bad cops from accountability. Whitaker tried to speak, to ask Gage how quickly they could sue the military, but all that came out was a muffled, pathetic grunt through his wired teeth. Gage didn't look sympathetic. In fact, he looked like he was attending a funeral. He leaned forward, resting his elbows on his knees, staring at Whitaker with cold, dead eyes. Don't try to talk, Brock, Gage said, his voice flat. Just listen, because this is the last time you and I are ever going to have a conversation. Whitaker's heart spiked, the heart monitor beside him beeping faster. Panic began to claw at his chest. You really stepped in it this time, you arrogant fool, Gage continued, shaking his head slowly. You didn't just hit a female soldier. You hit a federal undercover operative for Army CID. You assaulted a federal officer in a court of law on camera in front of a sitting judge. Whitaker's eyes widened to the size of saucers. Beneath the bandages, his skin went entirely pale. Federal operative? Gage confirmed, mercilessly delivering the karma. Minutes after you got knocked into next week, the FBI and CID raided our precinct. They came in with federal warrants. Brock, They bypassed the chief. They bypassed me. They went straight to your locker and your desk. Whitaker began to thrash weakly against the bedsheets, a muffled squeal of terror vibrating in his throat. Yeah, they found it, Gage confirmed, his lip curling in disgust. They found the ledger. They found the lockbox with the cash you extorted from those soldiers. And they found the baggies of narcotics you've been using to plant on suspects who wouldn't pay your toll. The blue wall of silence, the unspoken brotherhood that had protected Whitaker for years, was evaporating before his eyes. The union is dropping you, Brock, effective immediately, Gage stated, standing up and smoothing his tie. You are radioactive. The police chief has already signed your termination papers. You aren't suspended with pay. You aren't on administrative leave. You are fired. Whitaker reached out a desperate, trembling hand. Tears of pain and absolute ruin pooled in the corners of his eyes. And it gets worse, Gage added, pausing at the door, offering no comfort, only the brutal reality of Whitaker's own making. Lena Hargrove, the prosecutor you left out to dry today, she just signed an immunity deal with the feds. She's turning state's witness. She's giving them every single illegal traffic stop, every falsified report, and every piece of dirty evidence you ever handed her. The monitor next to Whitaker's bed began to blare an alarm as his heart rate skyrocketed into pure panic. He was trapped in a broken body, listening to his entire life be dismantled brick by brick. When you get discharged from this hospital, Brock, there won't be a police cruiser waiting to take you home, Gage said softly, his hand on the door handle. There will be 2 federal marshals waiting to transport you to a maximum security federal holding facility. You're looking at years for the extortion and corruption, and additional time for the assault on Sergeant Ellison. Gage opened the door, glancing back one final time at the shattered, ruined bully in the hospital bed. You always wanted to be the toughest guy in the room, Brock, Gage muttered. Let's see how tough you are when you're wearing an orange jumpsuit in a federal penitentiary, surrounded by the exact kind of people you used to frame. The door clicked shut, leaving Brock Whitaker entirely alone with the agonizing throbbing of his wired jaw and the crushing, suffocating weight of his own absolute destruction. The hunter had become the prey, and the trap had been sprung by the very woman he thought he could break with a single slap. Months later, the suffocating, relentless humidity of a Tennessee summer hung heavy over the Dirksen Federal Courthouse in downtown Nashville. The atmosphere outside the building was a chaotic circus of satellite trucks, local reporters, and national correspondents. The story of a corrupt local cop unwittingly assaulting an undercover federal military operative on camera had become a national sensation. Inside courtroom 4B, however, the air was entirely different. It was heavily air-conditioned, smelling faintly of rich leather, lemon polish, and the sterile, unforgiving scent of federal justice. The stakes here were not local misdemeanors or slap-on-the-wrist suspensions. They were decades of hard federal time in maximum security facilities. Brock Whitaker sat at the defense table, but he was utterly unrecognizable as the hulking, arrogant predator who had once strutted through the streets of Oak Ridge. County lockup had stripped him of his delusions and his muscle mass. He had lost significant weight, his previously barrel-chested frame now sagging beneath a drab, ill-fitting beige suit. His jaw, having finally healed from the brutal fracture Maya had delivered, sat slightly off-center on his face, giving him a permanent, pathetic wince every time he swallowed. The swagger was completely gone. Only the hollow, terrified shell of a defeated man remained. When his high-priced private defense attorney, a ruthless legal shark funded by Whitaker's hidden offshore accounts, had first reviewed the federal discovery file, he had immediately withdrawn as counsel. The FBI and Army CID hadn't just found loose cash in Whitaker's locker. They had unleashed a technological nightmare upon his entire existence. Using advanced data analytics software, federal forensic accountants had traced every single dollar Whitaker had extorted from vulnerable soldiers over the years. Furthermore, the FBI's cyber division had cracked Whitaker's encrypted burner phone, uncovering hundreds of text messages coordinating illegal stops, evidence tampering and witness intimidation. They had mapped his illicit network with terrifying microscopic precision, leaving absolutely no shadow for him to hide in. The blue wall of silence had shattered into dust. Several of his fellow officers had already taken plea deals, turning state's evidence against him to save themselves. He was entirely alone, defended only by a court-appointed public defender named Nolan Prescott, a man who looked thoroughly exhausted and resigned to a brutal defeat. The United States calls Staff Sergeant Maya Ellison, announced the lead federal prosecutor, a razor-sharp, meticulously prepared woman named Vivian Langston. The heavy oak double doors at the back of the courtroom swung open, and the gallery went pin-drop silent. Maya walked down the center aisle. She was in her immaculate Army service uniform, but the brass on her chest told a profoundly updated story. Prominently displayed among her ribbons now sat the Meritorious Service Medal, awarded by the Department of the Army for her instrumental, highly classified role in dismantling the Oak Ridge corruption ring. She moved with the predatory, disciplined grace of a professional who had flawlessly executed a high-stakes mission. She took the witness stand, her posture impeccably straight, her face the exact same mask of absolute chilling composure that had driven Whitaker to madness earlier. Whitaker couldn't bring himself to look at her. He stared down at his trembling hands, his knuckles white as he gripped the edge of the defense table. The phantom pain in his jaw flared to life. The memory of her fist, connecting with bone, replayed behind his eyes in an endless, agonizing loop. "Sergeant Ellison," Prosecutor Langston began, resting her hands lightly on the podium. "Could you describe for the jury the specific operational parameters of your assignment in the town of Oak Ridge?" "My assignment was a deep-cover joint task force initiative between the United States Army Criminal Investigation Division and the Federal Bureau of Investigation," Maya answered. Her voice rang out through the courtroom, clear, steady, and commanding. "Our target was a localized, highly organized syndicate operating within the Oak Ridge Police Department. This syndicate was specifically organized and directed by the defendant, Brock Whitaker. Over an extended period, we gathered actionable intelligence indicating that the defendant was systematically targeting junior enlisted personnel from Fort Campbell." A collective murmur rippled through the jury box. Maya continued, her gaze sweeping over the jurors. "The defendant utilized illegal traffic stops to extort cash, seize personal property without warrants, and plant narcotics to secure false convictions, thereby leveraging those convictions to force the soldiers into paying exorbitant fines directly to his network. And on the day of the assault in the municipal courthouse, Sergeant Ellison, did you fear for your life when the defendant approached you?" Langston asked, stepping out from behind the podium. Maya's dark eyes drifted slowly to Whitaker, pinning him to his chair like a biological specimen on a slide. "No, ma'am, I did not. I assessed the defendant as an undisciplined, emotionally compromised, and fundamentally untrained aggressor. When he initiated the unprovoked physical strike, I simply neutralized him, utilizing standard military close-quarters combat protocols. My primary concern at that exact moment was not my physical safety, but ensuring his assault was fully documented on the courtroom security cameras to finalize the RICO indictment for this trial." Public Defender Nolan Prescott stood up for cross-examination, looking very much like a man walking directly into a wood chipper. He adjusted his tie nervously. "Sergeant Ellison, isn't it true you deliberately provoked my client? You refused a lawful search of your vehicle on the night of your arrest. You embarrassed him in open court. You pushed a dedicated police officer to his breaking point." Maya didn't flinch. She leaned slightly forward into the microphone. "I calmly asserted my Fourth Amendment rights as a citizen of the United States, Counselor. I did not raise my voice, nor did I resist his unlawful physical force during the arrest. If a sworn police officer is provoked to the point of committing a felony assault simply because a black woman knows the law and refuses to be intimidated, then that officer is precisely the kind of violent criminal my task force was designed to eradicate from the streets." Prescott swallowed hard, having absolutely no rebuttal for the sheer truth of her statement. No further questions, Your Honor. Prosecutor Langston returned to the center of the floor, ready to deliver the final devastating blow. She queued up a massive high-definition monitor facing the jury box. Your Honor, the prosecution submits Exhibit F into evidence. This is the unedited, timestamped security footage from the Oak Ridge Municipal Courthouse, retrieved directly from the server room by FBI agents shortly after the assault took place. The courtroom lights dimmed slightly as the video began to play. It was crystal clear, capturing multiple angles of the room. The jury watched in stunned silence as Whitaker, his face contorted in an ugly mask of rage, marched aggressively toward Maya's defense table. The courtroom's highly sensitive transcription microphones had picked up the audio perfectly. The jury heard the venom in his voice. They heard the vile, undeniable racial slur hiss from his lips. And then, they watched him wind up his arm and deliver the brutal, open-handed slap to Maya's face. A gasp echoed from the gallery, but the video wasn't over. The jury watched karma deliver its instantaneous, undeniable verdict. In slow motion, they saw Maya's head snap back to center. They saw the flawless textbook pivot of her hips, the immediate transition from a passive stance to a lethal striking position. They watched the lightning-fast right cross connect directly with Whitaker's exposed jaw. The impact on the screen was visceral. They watched the massive bully lift inches off the ground, his eyes rolling back into his head. Before he even began his descent, they watched him fold onto the marble floor, completely unconscious, entirely broken by the woman he thought was beneath him. When the video finally ended and the lights came back up, the jury wasn't looking at Maya with pity or shock. They were looking at Brock Whitaker with absolute, unadulterated disgust. The trial was effectively over before the defense even had a chance to rest its non-existent case. The judge gave his instructions, and the jury filed out. They returned with a verdict in record time. Guilty on all counts of racketeering, extortion, deprivation of rights under color of law, and the felony assault of a federal officer. The hammer of federal justice had finally fallen, and it had crushed Brock Whitaker into dust. The sentencing hearing later felt profoundly different from the rapid-fire adrenaline of the trial. It lacked the shock value of the video playback or the sharp surgical dismantling of the cross-examination. Instead, the atmosphere in courtroom 4B had settled into something far heavier. The cold, inescapable, and permanent gravity of federal consequence. This was not a trial of facts. This was an execution of a career, a reputation, and a life. Judge Montgomery Hale presided over the sentencing, appointed to the federal bench precisely for his draconian zero-tolerance policy regarding public corruption and civil rights violations. Hale was a man who viewed a dirty badge not just as a crime, but as a treasonous breach of the public trust. He sat high behind the polished mahogany bench, staring down at the defense table with eyes that offered absolutely no quarter. Brock Whitaker was ordered to stand. He no longer looked like a man. He looked like a hollowed-out ghost, haunting his own ruined life. His legs, which had once confidently kicked open doors and stomped on the rights of innocent citizens, now shook so violently beneath the cheap fabric of his state-issued suit that a burly United States Marshal had to step forward, gripping Whitaker by the left elbow, just to keep him entirely upright. The permanent crooked wince on Whitaker's face twitched erratically as he stared up at the judge, his breathing shallow and erratic. The silence in the room stretched out, agonizing and deliberate. Judge Hale let the weight of the moment press down on the disgraced officer before he finally spoke. "Brock Whitaker," Judge Hale's voice boomed, resonating through the high ceilings like thunder rolling across a dark valley. "You were entrusted with a sworn oath. You were handed a badge and a firearm, instruments meant to shield and protect the citizens of your community. You were given authority over your fellow man. Instead of honoring that profound responsibility, you chose to operate as a parasite. You twisted the law into a weapon of personal enrichment. Whitaker closed his eyes, a single pathetic tear leaking from the corner and tracking down his pale, sunken cheek. You specifically targeted the very men and women in uniform who volunteered to defend this nation, Judge Hale continued, his tone dripping with an icy, unadulterated contempt. You recognized their youth, their vulnerability in a town far from home, and their fear of military reprisal, and you weaponized it. You extorted them. You framed them for crimes they did not commit. You stole their money. You ruined their military careers. And when you were finally confronted by an officer of the law who refused to bow to your pathetic intimidation, you resorted to the cowardly, unprovoked violence of a street thug. Whitaker's knees buckled slightly, but the marshal's iron grip kept him suspended. A pathetic wet sob escaped his throat, echoing loudly in the quiet courtroom. "Please, Your Honor," Whitaker begged, his voice cracking, sounding like a frightened child. I lost my temper. I made a mistake. I've lost everything. My pension, my wife, my home. Please." "You did not lose your temper, Mr. Whitaker," the judge corrected him coldly, leaning forward over the bench. "You simply revealed your true nature. When a man feels his absolute power slipping, his reaction exposes exactly who he is beneath the uniform. You are a bully, a coward, and a disgrace to every honest law enforcement officer in this country. And the federal justice system has a very specific, very permanent cure for bullies." Judge Hale picked up a thick stack of sentencing guidelines, squaring the edges on the wood with a sharp tap. "On the federal charges of racketeering, extortion, deprivation of civil rights under color of law, and the felony assault of a federal officer, I sentence you to decades in the custody of the Federal Bureau of Prisons, to be served at the United States Penitentiary in Atlanta. This sentence is mandatory minimum. There will be no leniency. There will be no possibility of early parole. May God have mercy on your soul, Mr. Whitaker, because the inmates in a maximum security federal facility certainly will not." The sound of the gavel striking the sound block was deafening. To Whitaker, it sounded like the slamming of a coffin lid. The immediate sound of heavy steel handcuffs ratcheting tightly around Whitaker's wrists was the only noise that followed. As the U.S. Marshals forcibly turned him around to drag him toward the holding cells, his legs finally gave out entirely. They practically had to carry him before he crossed the threshold into the holding area. Whitaker cast one final, desperate, terrified look back at the gallery. Staff Sergeant Maya Ellison was standing in the back row. She was perfectly still, her hands resting easily behind her back in a parade rest. She didn't smirk. She didn't offer a triumphant smile or a mocking wave. She simply looked at him with the chilling professional detachment of a soldier who had successfully neutralized a high-value target. As their eyes met for the final time, Maya gave him a single, slow, deliberate nod. It was an acknowledgement of absolute victory. The mission was accomplished, and the trash had finally been taken out. Later, the crushing reality of Whitaker's new existence truly set in. He was loaded onto a heavily armored federal transport bus, his wrists and ankles bound in heavy chains that clinked with every bump in the highway. The journey to Georgia was a silent, agonizing descent into hell. When the bus finally pulled through the massive reinforced steel gates of USP Atlanta, the towering concrete walls seemed to blot out the sun itself. Inside the processing center, his identity was methodically stripped away. His civilian clothes were confiscated. He was aggressively scrubbed down in a freezing shower, his head shaved to the scalp. The man who used to demand respect on the streets of Oak Ridge was handed a folded stack of rough, scratchy orange fabric. He was no longer Officer Brock Whitaker. He was officially stripped down to an administrative number, inmate 88491-042. As he was led by two heavily armed corrections officers toward his assigned cell block, the noise hit him like a physical blow. The cell block was a multi-tiered concrete cavern, a chaotic, deafening cacophony of shouting voices, clanking metal doors, and the heavy, suffocating scent of bleach and despair. Whitaker walked down the center tier, his eyes glued to the scuffed concrete floor, terrified to look up. But the inmates knew. News travels faster than light inside a federal penitentiary, especially when it concerns a dirty cop. Many of these men had been transferred from local and state facilities. Many of them had experienced the exact kind of corrupt, badge-heavy brutality that Whitaker used to deal out daily. An inmate, leaning casually against the steel bars of his cell, smiled as Whitaker was marched past. The man had a deep scar running down his cheek and eyes that held absolutely no warmth. "Hey there, officer," the inmate whispered, his voice slicing through the noise, sending a violent shudder of pure terror down Whitaker's spine. "Welcome to the real world. We've been waiting for you." Whitaker stepped into his tiny concrete cell. The air was stale and suffocating. The heavy steel door slid shut behind him on automated tracks, engaging with a final echoing mechanical thud that reverberated in his chest. It sounded exactly like the judge's gavel. He sat heavily on the thin, lumpy mattress, his hands trembling violently. He buried his face in his rough, calloused hands, and for the first time in his life, he truly wept. There was no shiny badge to hide behind anymore. There was no corrupt union boss to protect him. There was only the cold concrete, the unforgiving steel bars, and years of the hardest, most brutal karma imaginable waiting for him in the dark. Meanwhile, 1,000 miles away, in a bustling city on the East Coast, Staff Sergeant Maya Ellison sat quietly in the driver's seat of an unmarked tinted sedan. The rain drummed a steady rhythm against the windshield. She raised a pair of high-powered binoculars to her eyes, focusing clearly on a man in an expensive suit taking a suspicious envelope in a dark alleyway. The world was full of corrupt, arrogant men who believed they were entirely untouchable, and she was going to systematically break every single one of them.